Burnout. It isn't always stress. Sometimes it's grief in disguise. And if you recover from it like it's just stress, you can actually stay stuck in it for years. And I've seen this in clinical practice. My name is Dr. Scott. I'm a physician, and welcome. My thing is figuring out why people feel terrible when their labs supposedly look normal. Turns out there's real biology behind a lot of what we call burnout. And once you understand it, it's actually kind of fascinating. We talk about it here in plain English without the wellness fluff or the doom spiral. And I promise we'll make it even the heavy stuff, a little lighter along the way. In this video, I'm going to show you why stress and grief are actually very different biological programs inside the body. How burnout begins as chronic stress physiology, but eventually shifts to something much closer to a grief-like state. Why this traps people in what I call the sympathetic spiral of doom. Dun, dun, dun. We'll talk more about this. And why recovering from burnout requires a completely different strategy than simply trying to manage stress better. Some of you probably feel like you're managing stress better, but not so well, right? And by the end of this video, I'm going to explain why the people trying the hardest to optimize themselves out of burnout are often accidentally reinforcing the exact physiology keeping them stuck. Okay. Imagine this. You wake up exhausted after sleeping. You answer texts later and later because somehow even simple conversations feel expensive. You're still functioning, going to work, taking care of people. In my case, in physicians' case, there are many people and many physicians that fall into this category. You're checking boxes, but underneath everything, there's a strange emotional flattening. Like the color just got turned down on your life. And maybe the weirdest part is that if you think about it, you remember who you used to be. You remember being sharper. You remember being maybe funnier than you are now. Maybe not the funniest person in the room, I never was, but at least a little bit funnier, right? More emotionally available, more resilient, more creative. And now even recovery feels like work. So you do what high performers do. You drink more caffeine and get more crashes. You take more supplements without a framework. You start tracking everything and start having anxiety about all your markers. You do more cold plunges, more forcing yourself to meditate, and more trying to get back on track. And for a while, maybe a little while, this actually seems to help. But eventually you realize there's something uncomfortable here. This doesn't feel like stress anymore. It feels like loss. It's like some version of you quietly disappeared while you were busy surviving. And biologically, that distinction matters far more than people realize. One of the biggest misunderstandings about burnout is that people think it's simply too much stress. But stress and grief are actually very different biological processes, biological states. Stress is mobilization. Stress says move faster, solve the problem, survive the threat. Your heart rate goes up, your cortisol goes up, which is your stress hormone, your attention narrows, your energy gets mobilized, mostly by cortisol actually, which drops, you get more glucose in circulation, more fat in circulation. Stress is built for action, right? Stress assumes once this challenge passes, this too shall pass, we will get back to baseline. Unfortunately, it doesn't always pass, as we know in modern society. So grief physiology is different. Grief says something important's changed. Pull inward, repair, and reorganize. The body becomes quieter, heavier, more inward, more socially withdrawn, emotionally flattened. Motivation drops, inflammation rises, the recovery changes, sleep changes. Stress wants movement, where grief actually wants you to be still and go away from things. Stress physiology is designed to help you survive a challenge, where grief physiology emerges when the body realizes that challenge has changed you. And that pivot point right there is burnout. At first, burnout is absolutely a stress problem. There's no doubt about it. The system mobilizes cortisol, adrenaline, or norepinephrine, epinephrine, more overcompensation, more override. This is my aspect that I talk about in the sympathetic spiral of doom, which I just call the sympathetic overdrive aspect, right? And you can push through for a while. This is classic stress physiology, but eventually something changes. The body realizes we are not successfully adapting anymore, and the physiology shifts. This is related to mitochondrial dysfunction. The system stops prioritizing performance and starts prioritizing survival after the depletion you've been having because of the chronic stress. And this is grief physiology, but not because someone necessarily died, although this obviously could happen, but because biologically, grief is the nervous system's response to overwhelming loss, overload, rupture, and prolonged unsafety. Loss of energy, loss of flexibility, loss of reserve capacity. loss of emotional openness, and loss of connection to self. And this distinction really matters enormously, because if you treat grief physiology like a stress physiology, you keep demanding mobilization from a body that's desperately trying to conserve resources. That mismatch is where people get stuck, and I've seen this for years. And this is exactly where the sympathetic spiral of doom starts taking over. Most people think burnout lives entirely in the mind, but your body keeps score long before your conscious mind catches up. Sleep becomes lighter, recovery slows down, stress tolerance drops. Small problems suddenly feel enormous. You become emotionally thinner and more labile, so you're up and down all the time. And eventually the nervous system starts behaving as if danger is still actively happening, even when the original pressure has eased. And that's when people start saying, I don't feel like myself anymore. And biologically, they are right, because your cells may literally still be broadcasting a danger signal long before, or long after, I should say, the stressful period has ended. So here's where we're going. First, I'm going to explain what burnout actually does biologically. Then we'll talk about why people get stuck there, and sometimes for years. Then we'll cover why common recovery advice often fails almost completely. And then finally, I'll walk you through the sequence that actually helps the nervous system regain flexibility and recover capacity again. One of the most important concepts in modern cellular medicine is something called the cell danger response. And despite sounding vaguely like a Jason Bourne sequel, which Jason Bourne movie is your favorite, it's actually incredibly useful. The idea comes from a researcher named Dr. Robert Navio at the UC San Diego. And here is the simplified version. You ready? When the cell perceives a threat, it could be any type of threat, from infection, inflammation, trauma, sleep deprivation, chronic physiologic stress, toxic burden, metabolic dysfunction, or emotional overwhelm. It doesn't matter. The cell shifts resources away from growth and anabolic, which is growth signals, towards protection, which is more catabolic and breaking down. And this is where it actually really gets fascinating, right? And so in the cell, ATP is your energy currency, adenosine triphosphate. We make about 150 pounds of ATP every single day to meet the energy demands that we have. Fun fact, the most place of energy needs in the body is not your brain, it's your reproductive organs, actually, at least intermittently when you're trying to make babies, but otherwise it's your brain, right? But ATP outside the cell becomes an alarm signal, okay? So when stressed or damaged cells release ATP outside of themselves, the body interprets this as something dangerous is happening. The immune system activates, inflammation rises, the nervous system becomes hypervigilant, sleep changes, recovery changes, attention changes. Your biology becomes organized around defense. And this is where burnout starts looking a lot more like grief, actually, than simple stress, because grief is fundamentally a repair and reorganization state, where stress says return to normal as quickly as possible. Grief is actually saying normal itself has changed. That's why grief changes identity, motivation, social behavior, emotional access, perception of meaning, energy allocation. And that's why severe burnout often feels existential, the existential crisis of midlife, everybody, right? Because at some level, the body is no longer trying to optimize the old version of you. It's trying to survive the collapse of it. And this is, again, what I call the sympathetic spiral of doom. It's a combination of sympathetic activation, the fight or flight nervous system, and significant cellular stress, which is the mitochondria, the part of the cell that's making energy really. And this is what happens when you're under chronic sympathetic overload or chronic mitochondrial stress, or both. And what happens here is that you flip on that cell danger response because of this chronic stress. At first, though, in the beginning, the body does adapt pretty beautifully. You push harder, sleep a little less, use a little bit of caffeine, you can override your recovery, you can stay hypervigilant, you can keep performing, right? And initially, the symptoms compensate, right? Usually you feel okay until eventually you don't, because prolonged sympathetic activation starts impairing these exact same systems that are required for recovery. Sleep becomes lighter and less restorative because you're always in stress mode. Inflammation rises because you're always in stress mode. Mitochondrial energy production becomes less efficient. And this is kind of the big linchpin in all of this, is that when mitochondrial energy production becomes less efficient, there's less energy being made, and there's more inflammation, and there's less energy and more inflammation. Well, those organs that need a lot of energy are going to stop working as well as they did before. Your blood sugar is also going to get more dysregulated. Your stress tolerance is going to go down. Your recovery overall is going to take longer. The nervous system becomes increasingly threat sensitive. And here's where it gets important. At a certain point, the body stops treating stress as a temporary mobilization problem and starts treating it as an unresolved survival threat. That's the transition from stress physiology to grief physiology. The system no longer says push harder. Now it says conserve everything possible. And that's why people in deeper burnout often describe emotional numbness, depersonalization. They don't feel like they're in their body anymore. Disconnection, inability to feel joy, social withdrawal, exhaustion after simple tasks. It's not at all laziness. That's actually conservation biology. Your body is trying to preserve what energy it has available. Because you're in this inflammatory cell danger response that hasn't resolved itself, you are in conservation mode. And unfortunately, modern culture massively actually misreads this state. We tell people to, move harder, optimize harder, push, stay disciplined, build, grind. Meanwhile, the physiology is essentially waving a tiny white surrender flag out of your mitochondria saying, please help me, help me. Burnout is not simply stress overload. It is unresolved biological debt. The body borrowed energy, recovered capacity. The body just doesn't have the emotional resilience anymore. The sleep quality is down. Hormonal stability is out of control. And the nervous system flexibility is no longer available. And the bill has finally arrived, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why burnout feels like I'm overwhelmed, maybe a little bit, but more like something inside me has disappeared. And that's grief physiology. And this is exactly why some people, the most popular recovery strategies actually, can completely backfire in this state. People can unintentionally make things worse because once someone realizes they're burnt out, they often respond by attacking every recovery the same way that they attacked their productivity, meaning like they're attacking their recovery the way they attack their productivity, right? More intensity, more optimization, more discipline. Listen, I'm a big fan of a cold plunge as much as the next guy, next physician, the next person who likes cold plunge. I enjoy it on occasion, right? But the biggest mistake people make is assuming burnout requires more activation. It requires more sequence, more motivation, more optimization, more sympathetic drive. But if the physiology has already shifted into conservation and repair, aggressive activation can deepen the mismatch. You're essentially asking a system in grief physiology to behave like it's in performance physiology. And that's why people crash even harder. And I've seen this a ton in clinical practice over the years, because you cannot regulate a depleted system, just like you need to have energy to not have anxiety. And I'll talk more about that in other videos. But in this state of burnout, where you're now in grief physiology, meditation can actually feel agitating. Cold exposure can feel draining. High intensity exercise can actually worsen your exhaustion. Fasting can increase your hypervigilance and make you crash. Not because the tools are bad, it's because the body no longer has the budget required to adapt appropriately to the stressor. The same intervention that built resilience in a recovered system can deepen entrenchment in a defended one. That's one of the biggest missing things in this conversation in modern wellness culture. So the goal is not to eliminate stress forever, of course. The goal is to restore flexibility. This is what I call the parasympathetic edge, the ability to move into recovery when needed and then back into action without carrying a residue of stress everywhere you go. But that capacity has to be rebuilt in sequence. First, restore energy availability, sleep regularity, nutrition sufficiency, blood sugar stability, reduce inflammation, support mitochondrial function. From there, once you've optimized or at least started to optimize the cellular function, then you rebuild inhibitory tone. That's where things like safety, social connection, restorative sleep, breath pacing, GABAergic support, GABA, the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain, can really be helpful. And appropriate recovery tools, they actually start landing, all of this starts landing properly once you've sequenced this and once you've optimized cellular function, along with down-regulating the nervous system at the same time. And then, only then, More aggressive hormetic training becomes useful again once the system is more regulated. Go back to your cold plunges, your hard training, your deep, high heat saunas, fasting, performance optimization. The body has to feel safe enough to adapt before adaptation becomes productive again. Let me say that again. The body has to feel safe enough to adapt before adaptation becomes productive again, okay? And so context matters more than trends, everybody. If you're stuck out in this burnout physiology, I'm usually thinking about at least starting with tools to reduce the alarm state itself. Now, this could be things like very simple photobiomodulation, architecture, sleep optimization, gentle movement, restorative breath practices, nervous system pacing. Consistent circadian rhythms can go a long way, and consistent meal timing can go a long way. Hyperbaric oxygen therapy is an interesting tool that I use, but I use only mild pressures in this state. If you use deeper pressures, it's too much stress in the body. But mild ones can actually be very helpful in these initial stages, just giving some more oxygen to the system, getting more energy produced. They work in the system, they work with the system rather than demanding adaptation from it. Sometimes carefully chosen mitochondrial support or GABAergic support can also help the nervous system regain enough reserve capacity to actually shift towards recovery again. And that's really important, right? Because if you can downregulate the nervous system, you're going to start bringing yourself out of that burnout physiology. And then once the system regains more capacity, that's when you can go into more of those fancy biohacking performance tools that all of us really want to do, right? Once you understand this distinction, that you need to work on the system cellularly and downregulate the nervous system before pushing more, burnout starts becoming much more recoverable and much less mysterious. So let's go back to that person staring at the unread text in the beginning, dragging themselves through the day, wondering why they can't seem to snap out of it. Maybe they weren't lazy. Maybe they weren't weak. Maybe their body had simply shifted into a prolonged defense and repair state that never fully completed. Maybe what they call burnout is actually a body mourning the prolonged loss of safety, recovery, flexibility, and reserve capacity. And maybe the reason they couldn't push through is because the physiology had already moved past stress and into repair. That changes everything, because now recovery stops being, how do I force myself forward? And it becomes, how do I help the body complete the repair cycle it never got to finish? One of the hardest parts about burnout is that people around you often expect it to look dramatic, but sometimes burnout looks incredibly functional. You still show up, perform, smile, still answer emails. Meanwhile, internally, the system slowly loses access to flexibility, recovery, joy, and emotional openness. And that's what I think is so important for all of us to listen to and hear today. Burnout is often much closer to grief than stress, because at some level, the body is trying to repair and reorganize after a prolonged period where life exceeded its ability to adapt in real time. The good news is that your nervous system is extremely adaptable. The healing cycle can continue, and you can shift yourself there. The sympathetic spiral of doom is not a diagnosis. It's a framework. It's a pattern that we can reverse, but not through more force, through sequence, through safety, through restoring the biological conditions that allow the body to stop defending and start recovering again. Thank you very much for listening. We'll see you next time. I'm Dr. Scott.